Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is a recent reads, La Tercera by Filipino writer Gina Apostol, The Maniac by Benjamin Labatut, which I assume has been translated. Maybe not. Okay, not translated. Shame by Ernaux. Well, this has just come out on Fitzcarraldo. It's first published in 1995, and this has been translated by Tanya Leslie. Then two books by Marguerite Duras, The Malady of Death and Destroy, She Said. Destroy, She Said, translated by Barbara Bray. In fact, both translated by Barbara Bray. And then some non-fiction, Sleepless by the French author Darrieussecq, and that's translated from the French by Penny Houston. And then on the back of that I picked up some of Darrieussecq's fiction. In fact, this was her debut novel. This is called Pigtails, and this was translated by Linda Coverdale. Right, so I'm going to start with the Apostol. Came out this year. Now, I'm a big fan of Gina Apostol's books, Insurrecto, Bibliolepsy, and The Revolution According to Raimundo Matter. And two of those were 5 stars, one was 4 stars. And what I really like about her work is it's inventive, it takes stylistic risks, and it's very caustic, it's very acerbic. So it's sort of about sort of Filipino, the Philippines sort of colonial history and emergence into the modern day, where it's still beset by all sorts of problems and legacies from its colonial days, where it swapped hands from being part of the Spanish Empire to the Americans' fledgling empire under gunboat diplomacy in the late 19th century. The problem with La Tercera is that while some of the sort of writing flourishes are there and her sort of linguistic playfulness, it's a lot more conventional. It has a much more autobiographical feel, and it's a sort of straight historical narrative, really, even though it's sort of a writer character, presumably the author herself, looking back through some source material, back at her family history. And it just doesn't impress me as much, and it was a bit of a slog in places. There's quite a lot of untranslated sort of sentences and small paragraphs, and normally I would take the time to go onto Google Translate and type it in, but because you don't know whether this is Tagalog or Waray, which are the two main languages of the Philippines, I didn't, because, you know, I could have typed in the one and it turned out to be the wrong one and I have to do it all again. Anyway, so the story is that this author character lives in New York, and she's been summoned back for the death of her mother back in the Philippines. And her mother is this extraordinary character who every summer used to leave the kids in this place called La Tercera with the maidservant, and that the La Tercera was since just sort of rot. It was rotting then, and it's even more rotten now. But it became a legal dispute between two uncles and an adopted daughter who was disabled, and she took them to court for the property and won. The source material is the writings of one of the uncles when he was young, when he'd stowed away on a boat, and on discovery the Americans press ganged him not into their army, but he was there to sort of record these sort of colonial goings on. And one of the interesting things, which I think is sort of a bit underdeveloped, is that this boy is a synesthesiac. That is, his senses are sort of jumbled together, and that he can sort of smell colours or words, appear to him as colours, this sort of jumble of senses. And that represents his sort of mental and emotional turmoil for being a young boy growing up in the midst of a colonial war, albeit when it's introduced, that was the colonial war against the Spanish. So that was interesting, but it wasn't really developed. So a lot of it sort of centres around this sort of patchy narration that he's left behind, and that his great niece, I think it's a great niece, has picked up. And it was slightly, I couldn't quite work out the politics of this. So the story of the Filipino resistance to the American colonisation, there are no sort of real original narratives. And yet the author, the American Filipino author character in this, she has one. She has her great uncle's narrative. And an old school friend of hers, who's now sort of something in the Filipino sort of cultural sort of authorities, has said, you should hand this over so we can put it on display. This is a vital bit of Filipino history. And the author says no. And I don't know, I'm a little troubled by that, that sentiment, whereby for her own personal use and really personal gain, because, as I say, that source book is a great chunk of this book. Now, I don't know how much of that is true, but as I say, it does have an autobiographical feel about it. But it's like she's putting her personal career and her personal writing needs ahead of the country. I don't know. I was slightly nonplussed by that. So all in all, this, as I say, it did drag in places. It's quite a straight historical narrative, even though it's fragmented between the different time periods. The most I got out of this book was some of the writing. I mean, as I say, she's a fabulous writer. So, for example, she writes a line like, anger does not corrode, it clarifies. Or this one, talking about the Americans in their invasion of the Philippines. His men always on the lookout for booty. This war is not a battle, but a bazaar. Which I just thought was great. And then sort of slightly longer sort of piece of writing. She's talking about trying to understand this narrative that her great uncle has left. I cast off isolated objects from my reader's plate, pending comprehension, e.g. a drawing of what looks like a drumstick or a bayonet. Whole pages in simple, childish Spanish, even I can understand. Novena prayers I know the responses to. A dormant figure on a mat, or is that a torture rack? A map all in blue, an extended description of an arrangement of chicken wire, disjoint song lyrics in different tongues, a host of incomprehensible words in an adolescent's theatrical hand, and too many Catholic cowlick O's. The shapes of moths on long-lost words, a blot that seeps deep, a well of gore, a calligraphic grave inset in blank sheets. So I just think that writing is stunning, but it's all too diffuse because there's a lot of, different characters and their names and what, that's sort of where they fit into the family history, dilutes and diffuses the excellent writer that there is. So I gave this 4 stars. I was slightly disappointed, I have to say. And on to The Maniac by Benjamin Labatut, who's Chilean, but also has Dutch ancestry. And if you remember his book, When We Cease to Understand the World, was longlisted for the Booker International Prize. I think that was the prize, which is why I thought this possibly has been translated. This is very much in the same sphere, whereby he takes real-life historical characters and sort of just expands them out. But whereas that book had 5 or 6 different characters, this concentrates very much on, there's 3, but it's really the central one, which dominates most of the pages of the book, is Johann von Neumann, who was born in Hungary, had to leave because of the Nazis, but was this sort of child prodigy, just a genius at maths and science and logic, and had so many fingers in so many pies of sort of modernity, of the sort of technology and science. So, for example, he was the first person to apply the mathematical equations to quantum mechanics. He basically invented game theory. He didn't invent the computer, obviously, but he designed the first computer that would enable them to develop the hydrogen bomb. And indeed, the book says, the first question he asked of this great computer he built is, how do you destroy the world? And the answer is, build a hydrogen bomb. And he was also tilting towards what we now understand as AI, and that, you know, for him it was always a quest to distinguish, or not even distinguish between, but sort of to compare and contrast human logic and human thought with that could be reproduced in sort of mechanical and computational machinery. It was a sort of a lifelong quest. There's also the question of that basically he took other people's work, and they sort of screamed sort of foul play about it because he'd stolen it, but he took it on so many levels and developed it so much further down the line that it was effectively sort of new work and new inventions. He was an awful character. He was very spoilt, very indulged, but a very interesting central portrait. And then we come to the third section, which is really where the AI kicks in, where, you know, everyone remembers the Deep Blue computer from IBM that the reigning chess champion, I think it was Garry Kasparov, took on in a challenge, and the computer beat him, and the whole world was shocked. You know, what did this say about the limitations of mankind's brain versus the unlimited nature of mechanical thinking? But it's not looking at that. It's looking at the next generation of that, where the game Go, so the world champion, who was a South Korean, was challenged by a computer system that had been developed by a British designer of, I think he was Maltese or Cypriot origin. And the difference between Go and chess is that to design a computer to beat man in chess, it's all about computation. It's all about, you know, mathematical calculation, whereas Go is a much deeper game. Now, I've never played Go, so I'm only relaying this is what this book suggests. That Go is a much more organic, creative game, and almost sort of spiritual and sort of religious sort of undertone to it. And therefore a computer couldn't just get by on computations and probabilities, because there was this human factor of, as I say, the sort of organic and the sort of spiritual. And the computer beats the Go champion to suggest this is the next generation of AI that is much more closely mimicking how humans think. And that's the point of the book, really, that von Neumann had opened the door, and now, you know, we're sort of much closer to human thinking and thought processes captured in AI. I found it fascinating, but I did feel that I think it was a best of 5 between the Korean player and the computer, and each of them won one game by playing a move that was so unlikely and so unpredictable, and it basically sort of destroyed their opponent at the board, and they went on to win that game. And I was trying to think what that sort of said, because you've modelled this computer. It teaches itself by looking at every single Go game from World Championships that have been fed it, but then it, unlike the chess thing, where it's just sifting through every single potential move, the computer teaches itself what the best move would be, because there's like exponentially more potential moves, and the computer is cutting through that by basically thinking like a human what the next best move is, rather than sort of a blanket computational analysis. But I did wonder, as I say, that the machine played a move that was so sort of left field in the same way as the human did, that led both of them to win those respective games. I'm not quite sure what that says about AI, whether it can reach deeply into man's unpredictability and reproduce that unpredictability, or whether it can, you know, even though it won that one game by that method, it reverted to type to win the other games, and therefore computers still can't quite ascend to the sort of human quixotic nature of human thought and reason. You know, there are emotional elements, there's unpredictable elements, there's all that sort of thing. So I was slightly in two minds, but overall I really enjoyed this book. I just thought it was a very good read, very engaging. Von Neumann's a fascinating character. To see him involved in so many key modern technologies and bodies of thought. 5 stars. And on to Annie Ernaux, Shame. So as I say, this was written in 1995, but has only just been translated into English. And it starts off, the first line is something like, you know, I remember the day when I was 12 years old when my father tried to kill my mother, which is, you know, an amazing way to start a book. And it goes on into that how, for her, as a 12-year-old girl, the world was never the same, because suddenly it was unpredictable, it was unstable, everything she'd taken for granted, she could no longer take for granted. And I thought that was set out as a really interesting study, but actually, a lot of this book is, you know, as per the name, the title of the book, Shame, is actually about her embarrassment and shame at the class that she came from, which is a very sort of rural working class. When she finds herself at private convent school, because obviously she's very bright as a child, and 38 years later from that 12-year-old, she's trying to match up the pre-violent event 12-year-old and the post-violent event 12-year-old, and she talks about her upbringing at the convent school. She talks about the social mores of the little village where she grew up in. And it almost seemed to be a different book entirely. It was about shame. It wasn't about that act of violence. She's looking at 2 photos from that time when she was sort of 12 or younger, and trying to reconcile them with she's trying to get back to that time of the girl of the photos and how that matches up to where she is now. So towards the end of the book, she writes this: I have brought to light the codes and conventions of the circles in which I lived. I have listed the different languages that enveloped me, forging the vision I had of myself and the outside world. Nowhere could I fit in that Sunday in June, which was the act of violence of her father. What happened that day could not be put into words in either of the worlds that were mine. And that's sort of it, really. That's where the book, I felt, very much sort of petered out. It didn't really delve into the violence. I mean, she said her father never did it again. And the way it's written, I suspected, yes, it was an act of violence. He grabbed his wife's collar and held her against the wall. I'm not sure that he was trying to kill her. He was enraged. They were having an argument, and he lashed out. But it didn't read to me that he was trying to kill her. Yes, fair enough, a 12-year-old girl might interpret that violence as he was trying to kill her, but it didn't read that way to me. So as I say, it's almost two different books. There's this act of violence, that complete upheaval of her world that she'd taken for granted up to that point. Yeah, absolutely. But then it's about sort of shame of her class difference when she's at a convent, all the expectations of the locals in the village. I couldn't quite reconcile that with the act of violence, and I don't think she can either. I don't think she can reconcile that she'd been brought up in this milieu. She'd been sent to this convent school, obviously a very formative experience. All your sort of primary ideas came from a strict church upbringing, which she's obviously moved away from by the time she's 50, 38 years later. But I couldn't quite see her reconciling this, and I found that a source of frustration. 3 stars. And on to the 2 Duras books. I've only previously read The Lover. I know Marguerite Duras is a favourite of the booktuber Celia over in Norway, and I thought it was about time I read some more. So the first thing to say is they're both very, very short, 80 pages and 88 pages, and the thing to say is the print in both of them is huge. So they're really quick reads. And the Malady death I really liked. I gave this 5 stars. And it's basically a man hires someone we assume is a prostitute to basically stay with him for a set period of time. I don't know if it's a week or 2 weeks, whatever, because he's trying to discover and understand the nature of love, which so far has eluded him. And the woman It's basically saying, well, it eludes you because you're permeated by the malady of death. If you don't have love in your life, there can only be death. And the question is, has the malady of death ascended on you because you can't find love, or does the predisposition to the malady of death prevent you from finding love? And it's very erotic. The woman is written as an object of seduction, but it's been written by a woman, so it's not voyeuristic. It is beautiful. It is some stunning writing. It's mixed in with the landscape. Their hotel room overlooks an oceanic coast, and the descriptions of the waves, the clouds. It's just brilliant. Very short, very punchy. 5 stars. This, however, I found a lot less satisfying. It was made into a play and it was made into a film, and it's a book that very much wants to be a film. And even the epilogue is Duras giving sort of stage directions for the stage version. So a woman is in a sanatorium to recover from stillbirth that she's had, and she's sort of descended upon by a ménage à trois, 3 people, 2 men, 1 woman, who are basically very menacing. And there's lots of dialogue back and forth. It's all very sort of Pinteresque, really, of things not said but implied, and an ambience and an atmosphere of threat and menace. And then finally her husband comes to pick her up and take her home at the end of her stay. And that's it. And it's done, as I say, very filmically. It's dialogue heavy. The descriptions are spare but with a visual eye. And there's one thing I cannot stand in literature, which is books that want to be films. If you want to write a film, write a film. If you want to write a novel, write a novel. The two do not align, to my mind. So I didn't get on with this at all, I'm afraid. 3 stars. And on to some non-fiction. Sleepless by Darrieussecq, who I think was Basque French. And this starts off pleasingly enough, where she collects lots of literary references to sleeplessness, because many authors have been sleepless: Kafka, Proust, Hemingway, Duras, in fact, which is what made me put Duras back in my mind to pick up some books of hers and read. And it's, as I say, it's quite comprehensive, all these sort of quotes and stuff. And while it retains that sort of referential element to sleeplessness referred to in literature, it moves on to the more sort of the more prosaic side of it. So it talks about hotel rooms, when this is an author who does lots of reading tours all over the world. So she's spent a lot of time in hotel rooms, between strange beds, which for an insomniac is always a challenge. She talks about pharmaceutical remedies, the different merits of different ones. She talks about feng shui, all these sorts of stuff. So it's pootling along quite nicely. And then after the hotel bed section, unfortunately, it seems to go in a different direction. Again, it seems to be another book entirely, where she's talking about periods of her life where she's slept under canvas in the open air of former French colonies, mainly in Africa. And it's becomes much more of a travelogue than a book about insomnia. I really didn't get the connection between the two. So it started off really well, but then, as I say, it sort of went a bit askew, really. So I think I gave it sort of 3.5, 4 stars. And I'd say on the basis of that, because it is well written and she's obviously incredibly well read, I was interested to see what her fiction was like. And this is her debut book, Pigtails, and I'm not sure how representative it is, because I really thought this was severely lacking. It's basically about a young working class woman who is desperate for money. She gets a job in a perfumery, which is in a sort of boutique, and they offer extra services of massages. She's very voluptuous. She soon becomes incredibly popular, but there's lots of sort of servicing the clients going on, as her female clients are gradually replaced by the male clients. And gradually she's transforming into a sow, a pig. So a very Kafkaesque sort of metamorphosis. And it's disgusting, it's over the top, It's quite flippant. I mean, it is pretty good in trying to imagine what a human in pig form would be like, and that gradual transition of the food we eat as humans to the food a pig eats, the fact that she's, you know, the effect of mud is almost orgasmic for her, all this sort of stuff. So it's not throwaway, it's not disposable, although it does move incredibly quickly. You know, the number of French republics that rise and fall within the within the course of a paragraph, because there's a politician who's very important in her life. That's why it has that political element. So it's clearly a satire, it's clearly a fable, but it was a bit icky for me, and yeah, I just didn't really get on with it at all, I'm afraid. So I gave it 2 stars. But as I say, I don't know if that's a good sort of introduction to her writing or not. I'm sure she doesn't write these sort of over-the-top, sort of, you know, satirical fables. When I say it's icky, it's quite Dussardian in its tone and in some of the events portrayed. So yeah, 2 stars. And that's it. That's my recent reads for this week. I'm not sure what I shall be picking up next. I still have Solenoid by Cartarescu to get to. But as I say, I'm not quite sure what I'm going to pick up next. So thank you, BookTube. Till next time.